4,000 years ago, the ice left Yorkshire. As the glaciers passed by, they scraped away earth and vegetation to reveal the limestone below, a flat bare surface. Limestone is slightly soluble, and as rain hit it over and over and over the thousands of years that followed, joints and cracks in the limestone wore away into tiny streams, drainage to the earth below. The dialect word for those fissures is grikes, and the paving slab like regular stone they divide are clints. In modern terms, it's known as a limestone pavement. Malham Cove is one of those rare formations, not far from a limestone ravine called Goredale Scar, a few miles or so out of Malham, North Yorkshire. So as we walk out of Hove Station, past the charity shop and an office that she used to temp in, Kerry Turner tells me she struggled to think of somewhere that we could walk. She's lived in Brighton and Hove for 16 years, but says it's funny saying this is home. She says that had we had budget not been a question, she would have taken me to either Disneyland Paris or back home, just outside Bingley in Yorkshire. I could think of so many places in Yorkshire I find moving or interesting or whatever, but down here, one of the main reasons I chose this walk is that it's just what I do the most, just the ground under my feet every day. On the 18th of December 1985, Michael Eisner signed a letter of agreement with the French government to secure a 20 square kilometre site for the Walt Disney Company. Construction began in August 1968. Disneyland Paris officially opened its gates to the public on the 12th of April 1992. It was then known as Euro Disney. The park has strict rules that hide backstage Disney at all times. No photography or filming is allowed backstage. As soon as a crew member crosses the gate, they are required to be in character. They have a specific colour that they paint operational buildings called Go Away Green. So Kerry talks to me about what brought her to Brighton aged 80, and also about what kept her there. So when the plans she moved there with fell through, a streak of pride meant that going back home wasn't an option. So she temped. She worked as a dinner lady in a Catholic school, as a call centre worker in a bank. We walked down the seafront, turn east and Hove turns into Brighton. The skeleton of West Pier burnt out ahead of us. Kerry tells me that what's left of it, resistant to the flames of several fires, is now home to hundreds of starlings. In autumn you can see them gather. Flit across the sky in shoals, murmurations is the word. In Malham, it's the peregrine that owns the sky. In autumn, the swifts and house martins nest up high in the limestone. So we cross Hove into Brighton. You can feel the prosperity rise, as well as the tourist trappings. Kerry prefers Hove. It's scruffier, less fancy. She's lived all over Brighton and Hove since moving there, but it's Hove that appeals to her. All cast and crew of Disneyland Paris are required to pick up any rubbish that they come across. They must do so gracefully, though. In their contracts, it is stated that every action in the park must be committed with a flourish. As we walk across the seafront, the wind blows hard. I have to stop and tie my hair back. We talk about how we never really seem to dress properly for the journey from south to back home, how Leeds train station is one of the coldest places in the country. Brighton wind is persistent. It's like someone following you around, tapping you on the shoulder constantly. Yorkshire winds, they move differently. They dance with you, they push, they flourish, they shiver. It took me ages to get used to the wind down here, and the taste of the water. All these years, I still feel like a bit of a square peg in the south, Kerry says. Kerry has been making video games since she was 10 years old. She says, I started making text adventures. I got an Amiga 500 when I was 9. I learned a bit of BASIC, and then I learned something called Amos, which was like a fancy version of BASIC for the Amiga and had graphical and sound capabilities. So I used to practice making super simple games, little text adventures. Kerry made games for her little sister. She had a shoot-'em-up game maker, but used it to make adventure games, exploring games, between the ages of 10 and 13, 1991 to 1994. Kerry explains that she was very close to her sister, but also she played alone a lot, out in the countryside. I used to put on my clothes that I thought looked most like the sort of clothes that an elf would wear, And then I'd go and ride my bike, which was a unicorn, into the woods. But she says when I got a computer, this sort of habit towards solitary imaginative play, it came out in creating these little worlds, these little stories. She didn't really touch a computer in her late teens, but around 2001 at uni, she started experimenting again. She signed up to Sussex University and studied English literature, and as well as learning to play bass and being in some indie and electro bands, she started making games with the new game design tools that were emerging in the early 2000s. I guess it was my mid-20s that I consciously decided to start creating games again, and to finish them. Like, deliberately make these very small scope projects. I started imposing time limits on myself, 48 hours, just to see if I could make something. And I got really inspired seeing other people's work around that time. Stephen Lavell's stuff, particularly. It was interesting to me. It made me think, oh, there is another way, rather than these huge, very full-fat experiences. Why not try and be inspired by these more minimal ones? Kerry began making these small minimalist games. In 2008 and 2009, she released a series of short pieces under the name The Rabbit Club, which she calls experimental shorts. And following her degree as a self-taught developer, she's been working in studios and eventually as a freelance Unity developer on games, apps, VR, for the BBC, Channel 4, Mediatonic. Kerry enjoys making art, and part of that enjoyment is that she wants it to be her hobby. She's happy to work as a dev in larger studios and make her games on her own time. I find that kind of anti-commercial approach refreshing. Let's pause. Look around. You are surrounded by dead oaks. It's dark, just past dusk. The sky above you is desiccated, burnt skin pink. You see a creature ahead of you, ghost white. You move towards it, it's magnetic, it leaps away. The trees vanish as you walk through, only to be replaced with more dead oaks silhouetted. The sky above you is desiccated, burnt skin pink. It's dark, just past dusk. There is an animal ahead of you, it skitters. Its animations flicker, shaders code moulded to jitter, to deal with light in an uncanny way. As you approach it, there is music, it is spatial. If you turn away from it, it quietens, so you follow, so you follow, so you follow. Heartwood is a collaboration between Kerry and Dan Bibby, a musician also based in Brighton. As we begin to talk about her more recent work, we reach the main pier, renamed Brighton Pier following the demise of the burnt-out one. Kerry revels in the incongruity of the amusements, of the badly drawn, well-known cartoon characters on the carousel, of the penny pushers, the haunted house hoardings, the water ride, which is actually just a small roller coaster with no water at all. I mean, it's on a pier. It's needless and naughty. Kerry explains that she goes to Disneyland at least once a year with her sister. That's our thing. We've been doing that for years and years. I'm really into fake environments that are sort of there to entertain and delight me, like pleasure gardens and, to a certain extent, theatre and movie sets and theme parks. With Heartwood in particular, obviously it's meant to be a forest, but it's not in any way a realistic forest. The way the sound works, the way the light works. A haunted house is exactly what I was going for with that. I was super inspired by theme park rides, the ones where you just sit down and look at stuff like the Disney Dark rides. The stag and the rabbit come out as something else that I really like exploring in my work, which is universal symbols. I like the idea of exploring things through immediately recognisable symbols. So the thing I find really interesting about Kerry's aesthetic language, combined with Dan Bibby's slightly unsettling music, is how it connects their games to an English historical mythology that is centuries old. A language of signification that pre-exists Christianity. Horses carved into chalk, hares leaping through the fire in burning season. It plugs into the liminal space, which is a word that describes in-between spaces, dark, dusk, the forest, and more. It's Lear on the heath, it's Mad Max in the post-Australian wasteland, it's Ishmael watching the white whale rise out of the water, the wide, wide water. The forest and the moor are not our home, but they are a part of our souls as animals who grew up in this landscape, and in the context of that we invent stories like we invent homes, a means of taming, domestication, reflection. There are heaths, and there are woods. There is mist and dusk and snow and flood, and they are not places where we are safe, but they are places where we find out about who we are. There are borders, and there are people crossing seas. There are children crying in the arms of their parents. They are in between. So the last thing that Kerry says to me is that she begins to talk to me about Hartwood in terms of the Gothic. Gothic literature, it's often associated with female authors, Frankenstein being the most obvious example, not just monsters and magic, but architecture. In Gothic literature, the landscape is often a character in and of itself, often liminal spaces, ruined or abandoned or remote. The sound of the pier fades behind us, and we weave through Brighton's gay community towards the electric railway that in the end we won't have time to visit. Kerry and Dan are now working on a new piece, she says, set in the Pennines. Gigantic open skies, pylons, range, the drive from Leeds to Manchester, a place Kerry remembers from journeys on a coach to see bands play. The new game is called A Good Man. Hartwood is very Gothic in the sense of European Gothic, she says. The sort of closeness, claustrophobia, darkness. I guess the second game is more of an American Gothic. The fear coming from not ancient things and claustrophobia, but just being a tiny person under a gigantic sky. The Pennines make me feel that way. I've always thought of the American Gothic as a kind of more male one. It's the fear the cowboys have of being alone. It's The Road by Cormac McCarthy. The game Deadly Premonition. The music of Father John Misty. Kerry says of the new game, I don't want to evoke a feeling of being in the countryside, I want to evoke the feeling of pretending you're in the countryside. So one tactic of the Gothic, a guy called Sigmund Freud, when not pathologizing female sexuality hugely damagingly, described as das Unheimlich, which we sometimes translate as uncanny. It doesn't just mean weird, but a mixture of familiar and unfamiliar. And in games, we most often know uncanny from that description of the uncanny valley, a thing that you want to avoid. But there's value in the uncanny. In art, it's a means of drawing attention, asking us to look again, to notice. So Kerry explains to me that she's interested in the uncanny sense of being able to see the seams of something, where the details being correct, but there's still being something wrong. And that's something I've worked a lot with Dan, she says. He's got a real knack in providing sounds that are just dissonant enough, like providing the sound quality of being in a small room when the screen shows that you're outside. Kerry's work is imbued with the wildness of the Dales and the place as character of places like Disneyland. As we weave our way back along the seafront, she explains, A Good Man began with thinking about pylons and sky, and this sort of washed out, gloomy quality of light and drizzle and quick-moving clouds, that sort of all came as an image to me. My games don't often have a story, but I sort of tease out what I want the player to feel, and there's a particular narrative aspect, if there is one, then that will come out as well. Yorkshire and Disneyland Paris, thematically, are the two places I return to in one way or another. Both sides of the uncanny valley. The thing that is deliberately constructed, and the thing that refuses to be anything other than itself. We find Kerry in the middle. As Kerry and I walk back to Brighton towards the station, buying falafel and lavender on the way, she explains to me that sometimes she'll take people close to her to Yorkshire, to Malham Cove and Goredale Scar, as a kind of way of not testing them, but of saying, this is me. It's not just important to me, she says. In an odd way, it feels like it sort of says something about me. And if you can't respond to this, then maybe I feel like it's so resonant with me that if people can't chime with it, then I'm like, maybe there's something wrong here. So you might be able to tell from my accent that she and I share the north. And an unease with the south. It's nothing personal, Southerners. It's about the place we grew in, that grew us. The soil, the wind, the hard water, the limestone, harriers and hawthorn, the brambles and the moors, we are washed by it. Clints, etched out, fissured limestone under sky. Thank you.